Okay.
All right, so welcome everyone to what is now a virtual conference for Catholic secondary school counselors of New York City. And what we have today, and my name is Christine Curcio. I am the current president of CSSC New York City. And we have today is Dr. Gary Brucato. Hold on, I want to get his bio, so give me 1 second. And he is going to be speaking to us about trauma. And we have had obviously a very traumatic year. His talk today is called Wide-Scale Mental Health Effects of COVID-19, Unmasking a National Crisis. Dr. Gary Brucato is a clinical psychologist, researcher, and author who specializes in serious mental illness. In particular, his work has focused on the assessment and characterization of early psychotic disorders, including schizophrenia and psychotic affective disorders and severe violence, including serial, mass murder, and spree murder in the context of psychosis, personality disorders, and other factors. He is presently an adjunct associate research scientist at Columbia University Irving Medical Center in New York City, where since 2013, he has served as the assistant director of the Center of Prevention and Evaluation, COPE, one of a small number of worldwide research clinics dedicated to the evaluation, treatment, and study of psychosis risk. He was also a co-creator of the Columbia Mass Murder Database, examining mass murders worldwide since 1900. Dr. Brucato is also in private practice at Clarity Therapy in New York City. Dr. Brucato has written or co-written over 50 articles and book chapters on the subjects of psychotic illness and violence, and 2 books, including The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime, co-authored by Dr. Michael Stone, published in 2019. He also works with Dr. Ann Burgess of Boston University, the basis for Wendy Carr on Netflix series Mindhunter, to study diverse motivations for various extreme violent offenses. Dr. Brucato has been widely consulted by individuals, families, clinicians, and forensic specialists throughout the country. He has frequently appeared in the media to discuss his work in the area of violence, including in the Reels TV series, The Serial Psych, and Helter Skelter, an American myth on epics, or is it epics? His work has been featured by Psychology Today, The Cut, Forensic Science Magazine, Science Daily, US News and World Report, and WebMD. So Dr. Brucato, you have now shared your screen, and I would love for you to begin your talk today. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm exhausted listening to that, but I appreciate it. Okay, so let's jump right in here. Let me just sort of set a little timer for myself. Okay, so Christine, just let me know what time I should start to wind down, or what time would you like me to go until?
I think you said about like 45 minutes.
That'll work? Okay, great. Okay. All right, because we're just getting started a little bit after 3:30, so I wanted to time it. Now, I chose this image for the talk because this is an image that Vincent van Gogh had sketched out when, in the context of suffering from the mental illness, which ultimately institutionalized him. He was experiencing the terrible loss of everyone that he had loved, including his friend Gauguin and his brother, and so forth. And so I think it's a very interesting depiction, a very moving depiction of somebody experiencing the total isolation and emotional health issues. You know, I warned you in advance. I mean, some of the things we're talking about are going to be a little bit hard to hear because the facts about the COVID virus are very daunting to listen to. But we'll get right into it. Now, I think it's important to begin with a discussion of the scope of the problem. And I want to emphasize that numbers are going to change once we start getting new statistics about the post-vaccination period. But the statistics that are available reflect, you know, go back to just a couple of months ago when, you know, vaccinations had already begun. but not as many people had been vaccinated. But I think they give us a pretty good idea of the damage. So as of just on the 26th of May, when I finalized the talk, there had been 33,947,189 cases of COVID in the US alone, and there have been 605,208 deaths. That represents 2% of all the people who were infected. And disturbingly, you put that into context, you understand that we represent about 4.25% of the whole world's population, but we also represent about 20% of the fatalities from COVID. And there are a lot of reasons, that would take us afield of the talk to understand why we are an anomaly like that. But there are certain cultural factors and population factors that play into that. Now, prior to the pandemic, it's important to understand that American unemployment was actually at a 50-year low. Inflation was below 2%. And with this shutdown, there was a dramatic fall in the gross domestic product by 31.40%. We had not seen a rate like that since the Great Depression. Unemployment hit 14.7%. That's the highest rate since the period just after World War II, when people weren't employed because they had been fighting on behalf of the states. And at least half of households in the 4 largest American cities, New York being among them, had these enormous rates of people reporting that they had completely depleted their savings and couldn't pay their bills. That includes 53% of people living in the 5 boroughs of New York City, which is remarkable. That implies that about half of the people that are not telling you that they can't pay their bills, that they're at risk literally of becoming homeless. Now, 1 in 5 American households reported that they couldn't pay medical bills, and that includes for serious concerns. And that led to negative health consequences in about 57% of cases. So that's things like people have diabetes and are insulin dependent and can't get insulin, and now they are actually having a crisis, right? There's actually a biological crisis. A person needs an EpiPen because they have allergies to foods, and they go out somewhere and eat something and get sick, and they don't have an EpiPen because they simply couldn't afford it. On the list of necessities, it was low on the, in the hierarchy for them, et cetera, and so on. Now, what the statistics are telling us is that these issues have disproportionately affected Black, Native, and Latino Americans. So that 4 in 10 are reporting during the COVID virus that they're left with no expendable income or virtually no expendable income. And I will mention there, which I don't have in the slide, that there are also individuals who are undocumented who are not coming forward because they're afraid that they're going to be deported if they were to come forward and say, I need money, I need social assistance. I mean, they're not going to be getting a stimulus check, for example, if they're not reporting that they're out there, although some people say they should come forward anyway. Now, about 36% of US households with children can't afford educational costs, and about 18% of working parents can't find anyone to take care of their children so that they can't work. It was impossible for them to find childcare services. Now, when you divide up the country into urban and rural areas, it becomes clear that rural America is especially hard hit. Now, there's a few reasons for that. One cultural reason is that areas that have been sort of hesitant to get vaccinated, areas where there is lower education and people are less informed and are getting news and information from more questionable sources or by word of mouth, what you see is that they're harder hit. There's a very clear relationship between the cultural and political beliefs of an area of the United States and the areas that are hardest hit. And so rural America has been brutalized. About 43% of households in those regions report job loss, furlough, or hourly or wage reductions, with at least one family member affected, one adult family member affected. Now, what you want to bear in mind is that as all of that tragedy has been going on, and all that death and job loss and instability, there have been all these other things that have been sort of happening at the same time. You have to imagine the brain of a person being bombarded with all of these things at the same time. So we've got the deaths of loved ones and the sort of constant fear of loss and illness, not to mention the guilt that you might be responsible for giving them the illness that killed them, right? Then there was the social isolation. Then there was the less structured learning environments, right, that certainly affected young people. Then we had the extraordinarily polarized political situation, which unforgivably became blended with science surrounding the COVID virus. And then there was this terrible coup attempt at the US Capitol, not to mention a second impeachment of a sitting president, which is very destabilizing to people who at a time needed a symbolic glue to hang on to. There was this sort of, it was sort of like, losing the king during the French Revolution was very traumatic for people, even though they loathed him. You need the symbolism of a leader, whatever it is one believes about him or her. It can be very ungluing, right? So that was very polarizing, very difficult emotionally. And then there was this sort of reckoning with institutionalized racism and the bombardment with those kinds of terrifying images. And then what we also saw, which is a topic, of great interest to me, was this very dramatic increase in violence, which I had been predicting because the factors that I happen to know from my work drive violence, particularly mass shooting events, were all increasing. All of the economic difficulty and emotional difficulty and lack of glue and so forth, and institutional supports that can drive that stuff, the fragmentation of relationships, emotional health. And so, right on cue, you're starting to see the increase that unfortunately I feared. Now, we also know that people who get this virus have long-term medical issues. The idea that you get it and get over it is a myth. Most concerning is the growing evidence that people who have had the virus are at risk of strokes many months after having been infected or other cardiovascular risks. There also is a portion of these people who go on to sort of step into the psychological discussion who can develop psychosis, seizure disorders. There are some things that are less common, which you see there on the right side. But the greatest concern is this kind of neurological, sort of psychotic quality that some people can develop after surviving, particularly older people. Now, the mental health effects of this condition are remarkable. These rates that you're seeing here are higher than the average rates you would see in a given year, but these are the 4 conditions that are sort of going through the roof during the pandemic. Trauma and stress-related disorders, obviously, I mean, it's common sense that would be going through the roof. Anxiety or depression, substance use, and we'll break that down a little bit as we go along. And then just people who are experiencing just a kind of a sense that they'd be better off dead, or that it might be easier to commit suicide, is extraordinarily high during the virus. Now, here we see, you should see the mouse moving on the screen there, right? You see the mouse moving, everyone? Okay. So you see here this period from January to June, where you were looking at symptoms of anxiety disorders, symptoms of depressive disorders. So January to June is yellow, right? May 14th to 19th, 2020 is represented in the red. And December 9th to 21st, 2020 is represented in the purple. And so what you see is that across the board, with symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of depression, or either or, the gradual increase that you were seeing in people. Because what happened essentially is that by the time we got to the end of last year, people just felt that it was never going to end. I mean, it just, at that point. Now, interestingly, what the stats tell us is that there was a kind of a honeymoon period that came in the spring of 2020, where people were believing some of the things that unfortunately were, I think, made up or were fantasies, that the virus was just going to suddenly blow away, or that it was seasonal, or that it was nothing but a flu, and so forth. And so there was a period of time where symptoms did decrease because it was very attractive to hear those fantasies. But then by the time we got to the summer, you saw the astronomical explosion of symptoms again. And then they just sort of worsened, because what happened is that it was very attractive to hear those things, but they had no basis in fact. And so then you saw the peaking of all the symptoms that simply has continued. Now, Here we see the average share of adults reporting symptoms of anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, going all the way up until January of 21. And you can see here, there's really no question that there's been this astronomical increase. It's like a 4-time increase across 2 years. And here we see from the statistics that when you divide people up by age, and this is where I think starts to become of interest to people who work with high school students, it becomes very clear that young people who are in the age range of sort of being the seniors in high school versus early college are disproportionately affected by all of this. These are the people, I think it's because these are the ones that are most likely to feel that they have no future. When people are 65 years old and you say to them, life is foreshortened, it's very different than telling that to an 18-year-old. It has a very different psychological effect on a person because they've got their entire life ahead of them. It's a kind of a sense of, what's the point? Why am I going to barrel on another series of decades like this? And so, there are a lot of reasons having to do with the emotional state of younger people, the fact that there are other stresses affecting them, the fact that that's when mental illnesses first begin to develop in people, and all kinds of other factors, that socializing is more important to you at that age. But there is a totally lopsided, disproportionate effect upon people that are in that sort of age range of seniors that you might be seeing through early college. And I don't think that would surprise anybody in the audience here. Now, also interesting is you see the disproportionate effect upon by gender. Oh, I'm sorry, we're getting an echo effect. I think I don't know what's causing that. I think somebody has to mute probably. But so here you see the disproportionate effects upon female individuals versus males. Okay, when it comes to the stress of coronavirus, the virus negatively affecting them. So already we're getting a sense of disproportionate effects upon people who are non-white, who are younger, and who are female. Okay, which gives you a little bit idea of the profile of who will be streaming into a guidance office, in a high school, talking about symptoms. But that by no means indicates that you will not see it in the other comparison groups. Now, the other thing is that you want to understand that people who already have an underlying psychiatric disorder saw an increase in the symptoms of that disorder, right? So that you might have had an individual who had a sub-threshold condition. They were vaguely depressed. They were vaguely psychotic. They were vaguely OCD. They were vaguely anxious. And all of that sort of was on steroids, during COVID. So that what happened is a lot of people came to the attention of mental health as if their condition was new. But what it is that it's more like the building had slight fault lines and cracks in it for a while, and it took COVID to sort of cause the collapse of the building, right? So that you want to understand that a lot of the conditions that look new were really sort of sub-threshold until the condition was intensified in the context of COVID. And what's interesting about that also, as we'll see, is that seems to have been true also of certain personality qualities that people have. People who were a little bit paranoid became more paranoid. People who had a tendency to be OCD-like or afraid of contamination were 100 times worse, in some instances, etc. So that it was an exaggeration of who you are and your particular coping skills, which probably, let's face it, once upon a time in our lives had been useful for adapting to extreme stress in other circumstances. So it makes sense that they would come out and be used during this massive stress that we all experienced. Now here, fascinatingly, you see the effects upon people by race. What's intriguing here is you see this kind of interesting spike in the other category versus other groups. And it's a little bit farther out in some places. And the reason is that this group contains individuals who are Asian, who inexplicably are lumped into the other category in this particular chart. And the reason that's interesting is it turns out when you look into it, that it's because Asian Americans, particularly people who identified as Chinese or of a race that people foolishly mistake for being Chinese, also were experiencing the stress of being blamed for the virus, that they were afraid of getting beaten up or attacked because of xenophobia, right? And so that added an extra element of anxiety for individuals of certain Asian races. or groups, that is to say. Now, here are some other mental health statistics that are important to understand. So, particularly disturbing, 63% of unemployed individuals have increased substance use during COVID due to stress. When you poll them, it's due to stress, isolation, boredom, or less access to recovery resources, right? They closed down your group that you were talking to stay, your AA group. They closed down the facility where you were going to get your methadone, that kind of thing, right? And the most commonly used substances have been alcohol, marijuana, and opioids. Now, that's particularly upsetting because before COVID, we had an opioid crisis that was already going on, right? So you saw an increase in all of that during the virus. And of course, marijuana sale turned out to be a big money maker for people who needed income. And of course, now the government has caught on and there's legalization of marijuana. As soon as they, figure out how to tax it in a given place, there, people want to start making it legal. Of course, as somebody with expertise in how psychosis develops, that's very disturbing to me because about 1 in 100 people seem to have a genetic susceptibility where marijuana can bring out psychotic symptoms. I wish there'd be a warning on the marijuana when it becomes legalized, but that's another story. Now, the pandemic led to an increase of 1.5 million Americans with diagnosable mental illnesses. Now, think about that. That's extraordinary, right? And there's been an increase of about 460,000 people who are reporting suicidality, so 500,000. Now, even in the states with the greatest access to mental health services, 1 in 3 people is going without treatment. And that's either because their symptoms are not identified, right? There's a lack of availability of resources, or it just costs too much. And even more disturbing is that among the 2/3 that are getting care, 27% of them, only 27% of them are getting it stably. So that you wind up with 73% of them sort of going once to a doctor and that's the end of it, or they get on one Zoom call and the doctor says, I'll talk to you in a few months. So that it's not really mental health care. It's just like talking one time to a guidance counselor or talking to, and the problem is, as we'll see, this stuff requires stable, sustained time, care. So again, that's an enormous problem. Now, there's this sort of idea emerging among mental health experts that there's a phenomenon that was born during the coronavirus pandemic that might be called COVID stress syndrome, okay? And it seems to be characterized by these 5 traits, which the average person, to a certain extent, is experiencing one way or another, some variation or one of these symptoms or a few of them. And so what you're going to see right away is that people sort of divided up into people that became overly active as a result of stress, like compulsive checking behaviors or spending too much money to sort of feel better, buying lots of things on Amazon, calling up lots and lots and lots of friends to keep busy, taking walks, sneaking out when they weren't supposed to do things just to feel alive, And then there were other people who went into the hypoactive mode, where they became totally withdrawn and did absolutely nothing. They couldn't bring themselves to do virtually anything. So that you see kind of like the split between the people that had more of an anxious reaction, or an energized reaction, and the people who had a more depressive, withdrawn reaction. Now, the syndrome seems to be characterized by this kind of thing of constantly being aware of contamination. Now, you want to understand that, Freud always said that one of the reasons people developed an unconscious, that part of the reason that's adaptive to have an unconscious, is that we wouldn't leave the house if we were aware of certain realities, right? So that a person who develops this kind of OCD-like behavior is like a person who can't put something that's true but improbable into their unconscious enough to function. So, for example, a patient or a student might say, I go to a restaurant and every time I pick up a fork to eat with it, I can't stop thinking about the fact that it's probably been in about a few thousand mouths. If you think about that, it's sort of gross. So we put it out of our mind and we pretend that it's a clean fork that, has been and it never touched another mouth, and that's the end of it. Granted, it's been washed, but the concept is kind of disturbing. So we put it out of consciousness and we use it. But once you think about it and your attention is drawn to it, it bothers you a little bit. You realize that there are people that have had diseases and horrible, growths in their mouth or teeth that are unhealthy looking, that have used the same fork, and you kind of go, I don't want to use this anymore. I'm going to bring a plastic fork, like in Seinfeld, right? So that it's this idea of becoming too aware of certain things. And one of the things that most of us try to stick into the unconscious is the awareness that today could be our last day. The reality that we could have a coronary thrombosis on the way out the door, and the next minute somebody will be going through our drawers at home and looking at all the papers we left on the desk and saying, gee, I wonder what this notation means, and cleaning out our bathroom that we forgot to wash for a few days, etc. So that there's this kind of denial of certain realities, otherwise we wouldn't function, right? So you want to understand that for some people during this time of COVID, they became way too aware of certain realities, including death and contamination, so that you wound up with this sort of absurdity of checking, and avoiding, right? And that's a little too much for a human brain to do. It's going to have, as we'll see, repercussions on things like attention, hormone levels, and energy, and everything else. Then, of course, the syndrome is characterized by having to be way more aware than normal of every penny that you put into the bank or take out or what you spend it on, and more guilt about using it. Okay. Then here again, so the compulsive checking, and the other side of the coin is the constant fear of what's going to happen to you if you stop checking. So it's an OCD-like yin-yang, right? Contamination and the undoing of it, right? Then there's xenophobia, which was a huge component to the stress, because everybody wants to have something or someone to blame when they're upset about something. And then, although it was absurd, and then you had the effects of traumatic stress upon the brain. Now, all these things are going on all at the same time. And here are all the associations that you tend to see with this: avoidance behaviors, the panic buying, the social isolation distress, where you hit your limit of being alone, and anxiety and depression. Okay, now about 16% of people will meet criteria for that syndrome, that they'll have these 5 things. That's a lot of people, okay? Now, why is it that the coronavirus was so particularly traumatic? Well, people who study trauma will tell you that there are certain features of a given trauma that make it harder to get over, okay? So, for example, there's a very big difference between being traumatized by an earthquake and being traumatized by a rape or a sexual assault. And the reason is that with a rape or a sexual assault, the cause of the trauma was a human making a decision, whereas the earthquake was random and caused by nature. So the human brain can get over something that it understands to be extraordinarily rare, random, and not targeting them specifically. But when something is caused by a person, it is much harder to get over the trauma symptoms. And this is why the current discussion about the cause of coronavirus is becoming very important to people interested in trauma. Because if we believe that it was caused by somebody eating a pangolin or a bat, which was the original theory, it would be easier for people to get over when it passes than believing that it was intentionally cooked up in a lab as, and escaped. Because then we would have to come to the realization that somebody is trying to hurt us, possibly. So that adds to the trauma and adds a paranoid element that makes it much harder to deal with. So I'm sort of hoping that there's a little less talk about that, because you're going to start seeing people getting whipped up with a paranoid element and that xenophobia feeling justified, right? Now, that point about justification is important, because if a person has gone around for years having OCD symptoms or paranoia, and now it feels like they were smart to have those symptoms, good luck trying to get them to give them up. Because they're going to say, well, you told me that before the virus, and now I'm a genius. I was right to stay away from people. I was right to be afraid of contamination. It's been confirmed, you see? so that it's a gigantic confirmation bias that contributes to the retention of the trauma too. Now, the fact that the pandemic was totally out of the blue was an enormous problem because it's completely random. You had no sign that it was coming. It just happened, right? The second is that the threat is immediate, and the third being that it's completely prolonged. There's no sense of when it's ever going to end. I bet that if you polled people on the street and you said, signs are good that we're starting to come out of it, the average person would say, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. It's gone down before, and then it spikes again. There's going to be some people out there that aren't going to do what they're supposed to do, and we're all going to get sick again. It's premature, right? Because we have this kind of idea that we have no idea when it's going to return and how prolonged the problem is going to be. We don't like threats that are not fully understood. And it's adding to the problem that there's all kinds of conflicting information about it, that 1 minute you're told you have to wear a mask, and the next day you're told take the mask off, and then you don't know if you can trust the people around you that they really got vaccinated. You don't know if the vaccines definitely work. You don't know if you're going to need a shot every year. You don't know if you're going to get sick from the shot. So all this sort of conflicting information, and unfortunately a lot of it became politicized, even at the level of the CDC. You wind up with this kind of skepticism that makes it difficult to get your arms around the truth. And that adds to the trauma. The other thing is people do not do well psychologically when they lose structure and routine. And they do not do well when there's a disruption to social relationships. I mean, I can tell you that much of what helps in psychotherapy is simply having a human being there. Human contact in person matters a very great deal in terms of distress. And the other thing is this kind of idea of just sort of being ready to move on. That there's this kind of a stress of, I just want to put this burden down and move on already. I'd rather have the negative repercussions and just get what I want, right? So that people are losing the ability to make the long-term, foresight-driven steps that would make the virus go away. They'd rather have enjoyment now than put a mask on, for example, and hope that later all of those efforts lead to the thing going away. It's a kind of a problem when your executive functioning gets overridden by stress. You make more impulsive, foolish decisions. Now, there are a lot is going on in the brain for all of us, I must say, who are experiencing this trauma over time. And I would imagine that if you were to do MRI studies over the next few years, if you had MRIs on people from before the virus, I would be very, very surprised if you didn't start to see little alterations in some people's brains. Because you have to imagine a brain that is totally flooded with stress hormones, a brain that is experiencing a kind of a shrinkage possibly, or an atrophy because of exposure to stress, just like we see in people who are exposed to long-term sexual trauma, physical trauma, war, or other kinds of trauma. I think brains are going to change a little bit, particularly those of young people where the brain is still malleable, right? And, stress kind of moves along the spectrum, right? So there can be kind of positive stress where you have mild elevation in stress hormones and your heart kind of beats a little bit, but it's for something that the body wants. Like you see someone across the street that you're deeply attracted to, and you have to go across the street and talk to them, that kind of thing. And there's tolerable stress, like that something is temporary and you have people around you to support you and so forth. But then there's toxic stress, which is just this endless, prolonged activation of the stress system of the brain and the absence of protective relationships. You sort of need both of those factors for something to be considered toxic. Okay? And that's sort of what we're all seeing. Now, if you look by age across groups, you can see that there are behavioral signs of stress and anxiety that change, right? An infant or a baby will typically demonstrate differences in sleeping and eating behaviors when they're very stressed. Fortunately, they wouldn't be very aware of what was going on with corona. For toddlers and preschoolers, there's regression to sort of earlier behavioral milestones. So, doing things like crawling instead of walking, or gibbering instead of talking clearly, and so forth. Again, not terribly affected by COVID, although they might have some memory some years from now, particularly ones that are like, you know, nearer to 5 years old, where they'll remember the masks and things like that. School age kids, most people remember from age 5 on average. School age kids, what you see is more behavioral changes in impulse control. You can see things like bedwetting. You can see what's called bouncing off the walls. You can see trouble focusing. I took this slide from someone and they left out their opening quotation mark, which I will pretend I don't notice, but it bothers me. And adolescents and teens, you'll see increased risk taking, irritability, and withdrawing. Interestingly, once you're past age 18, you can have all of the above. All of the above. Okay. Here are just the flash on the screen are some of the classic physical signs of anxiety. So not only worry and dread, but stomach and digestive issues, which are, I have no doubt, going through the roof if you were to ask a GI specialist. Trouble with basic concentration and memory. A lot of people talking about brain fog and confusion, making mistakes they never would have made before. Changes in heart rate, changes in energy and sleeping. And I want to emphasize that these are happening to a lot of people. I wouldn't be surprised if they were happening to some people here, but they don't go around telling people. And irritability and restlessness. Okay. And when that hits the extreme, because of the way the limbic circuitry operates in the brain, you can have panic attacks, which by definition, a person does not know are coming from anxiety. They think they're having a heart attack or something like that. So they go to the ER and they say, I'm having a heart attack. Ironically, going to an ER during COVID increased the risk of getting it. So that was sort of one of the weird paradoxes is I'm afraid I have this virus. Now I'm going to go to an ER, right? Where I increase the risk of getting COVID, right? So it's kind of disturbing that people had to be put into that situation. Here are some signs of depression. Notice that some of them are vegetative, some of them are more intellectual, cognitive symptoms. I have a patient right now definitely affected by COVID, but who only intellectually feels sad and can't recognize that a lot of the changes in motivation and so forth are reflections of depression, right? But I think the average person will be pretty familiar with these symptoms. So just flash them on the screen. Now, in order to understand how people cope with stress, you have to understand that all of us is going to demonstrate some degree of depending upon what are called ego defense mechanisms, right? And the particular defense mechanisms that a person uses when dealing with something like COVID have to do with where that person is organized psychologically, right? So the Otto Kernberg, would say that some people are organized at a sort of psychotic level at baseline. And some people are organized at a borderline psychotic level, and some people are neurotic, right? And then there's a group that's called normal, although, some people would say that, if you take that off the table and you look at the average individual, the healthiest people are basically neurotic, right? Because they have neurotic reactions to reality. And so the three things that determine a person's organization and the defenses they're going to use when faced with adverse experiences are their degree of reality testing, meaning can the person explore alone or with you the probability that certain things could be real, right? So being somebody that works with psychosis risk, I mean, this has been my body for a long time. So like, let's say, for example, a person comes in and says, during COVID, I've become terribly afraid that if I don't walk around with saran wrap wrapped around my head, that I'm going to I'm going to get sick. And then I might say, but you're going to cover up your nostrils and your mouth, and you're in danger of suffocating. And if the person says, well, I don't care because the virus can't get through the saran wrap over my mouth and nose, that would be a problem with reality testing, because it means they're not in touch with the reality that they might die from having the plastic over their mouth or nose, because it's a very psychotic idea that that's the solution to this problem. Or they might say something even stranger than that, right? Like, I have thoughts in my head about the virus, and if I don't cover up my ears with headphones, the thoughts are going to escape through my ears, go into the world, and people are going to get infected. So there's sort of weird ideas that test the limits of reality are characteristic of people that are kind of in that psychotic range. And then the second question is, can the individual tell the difference between self and others? All of us, unfortunately, in the workplace or at home or whatever, have experienced individuals who have this problem of not being able to tell the difference between self and others, so that they project certain things onto you that they feel about themselves, or they think that you are the center of their existence, and if anything happens to you, they couldn't survive anymore, or having their entire health depend upon you being there, so you have no life. You know, these kinds of things are characteristic of certain types of personalities. And then, of course, you look at the maturity level of the defenses. Now, the idea here is that, you see, here's the normal, neurotic, borderline, and psychotic, right? So it just sort of to flash on the screen, sort of what I was just explaining to you, so that, let's say, reality testing, you'd expect it to be lost in someone psychotic. In a borderline individual, you'd expect some impairment, but the person ultimately will be responsive to thinking it out or reason, or after they have an impulsive emotional reaction, they go, wait a minute, that's ridiculous. That doesn't make sense, right? To the neurotic reaction where the person simply evaluates evidence, they think about it rationally, and they say that's a silly idea. And, you know, that's the one I sort of want to concentrate on as we go forward with the defenses. Because I think a lot of these things have to do with the ability to tell how realistic some of the threats are. Now, these are some classic defenses that all of us use. I mean, these are things we all do in everyday life, or some of us do, because it depends upon our organization. But you want to understand that each of these is a way that someone might be dealing with COVID. So denial, which is a more primitive defense, simply means that you say, this problem doesn't exist. It's not real. Never happened. It's not, I don't care. I'm walking around without a mask. I am not getting a vaccine. The whole thing's made up. The government made it up. I'm going to go out in the world, you know, and I don't need to tell you about stories in the news about celebrities that have, you know, made fools of themselves saying that this is all nonsense. And then there are pictures of them in the news with, you know, on a breathing device saying, oops, you know, I was wrong. There really is a virus. But denial is an unfortunate thing. You know, and I don't have to get into the process of denial that is affecting all kinds of things right now politically and so forth, but denial is a powerful, potent force. Displacement is an interesting defense mechanism where you transfer an inappropriate urge or behavior onto a more acceptable or less threatening target. So you go to work and your boss is nasty to you, but you can't tell your boss to flake off. So you go home and you kick the dog because you're angry, right? So it's a kind of a terrible displacement onto an innocent person. And you're seeing a lot of that during COVID. So for example, I'm in the post office and I don't like that the person working there is telling me to wear a mask because I'm angry the government feels like it's interfering in my freedom. So I yell at the 85-year-old woman who was online telling me, sir, could you please put your mask on? I'm vulnerable. That kind of thing is a kind of a displacement because the 85-year-old woman might turn around, or men might turn around and say, excuse me, your beef is not with me. Your beef is with the law. Like, why are you displacing this onto me? So it's a kind of a defense mechanism that people use. Projection is where you attribute an unacceptable desire or other aspect of yourself to another person, right? So you say, you're a horrible person. You're an immoral person because you have guilt that you're doing something that's contrary to your beliefs, right? So this is, you know, the person who goes around and tells people who don't want to take steps to avoid COVID that, you know, that they're endangering other people's, you know, lives or freedoms or something. So, for example, I had someone say to me on the street, I was getting into my car with a mask on, and the person said to me, you're endangering me by wearing that mask because it can slip up and cover your eyes and you'll crash into me. And I was thinking to myself, my God, is that a projection? If either one of us is endangering people, it's you, sir. Put a mask on. right? So projection. Rationalization, which is a kind of a little bit of a higher order defense, is where you feel justified in the behavior because you substitute something acceptable. So you say, it's not a big deal that I'm stealing from this store. My family is starving. The economy is down. I'm doing a good thing. Jesus would accept it that I'm robbing these cans of soup from the store because my neighbors are starved, right? That kind of higher order rationalization. Reaction formation is where you reduce anxiety by adopting a belief that is actually the complete opposite of what you believe, right? So you say, during my time with COVID, I completely gave up. I gave up my faith in any kind of higher power. And then you say, well, why would you give that up? Well, because it just became too impossible during COVID to believe in anything anymore. But then you discover that there's actually an adaptive or psychological reason why it would be convenient for the person to give up their faith. It's not really that they had an existential crisis, but it's something else. Like you find out that during the crisis, they have been engaging in a behavior that's contrary to their beliefs, and it's causing them a terrible amount of guilt. So they say, well, I just threw the faith out the window and now I don't have any guilt. And they claim that it's because of COVID or some external thing, but it's a psychological process by which you make an excuse for why you're suddenly believing the opposite of what you actually believe. Another example of that is the person who treats you really, really nicely when you know they hate you. That kind of thing. It's a kind of person is guilt that they dislike you, so they go out of their way to talk about how terrific and wonderful and fabulous you are when they actually despise you, right? And regression is where you return to the coping strategies of a less mature stage. So the person is crying all the time, or curling up in a ball, or sucking their thumb, or overeating, or buying too much garbage on the internet because it cheers them up, right? Whatever that is, it's a kind of regression to a childish way of dealing with stress. And I think a lot of us have done that during COVID. Repression is where you simply suppress a painful memory or a thought, but it's not completely unconscious. As soon as it comes up, you change the subject. I don't want to talk about that. I just won't look at the news. But it's real. You're not in complete denial, but you repress it. And repression, psychologists will tell you, is a little dangerous because it can lead to a kind of an overcompensation, like repressing sexual urges, and some people can cause them to go on a bender, that kind of thing. Sublimation is interesting defense, is where you take an unacceptable quality and you transform it into something acceptable. So a police officer, or I don't know, some figure of authority has anger issues, and they really liked beating people up when they were a teenager, but now they can't do that anymore. So they get a job where it's socially acceptable to bop people over the head with a wooden billy club, and it's been sublimated so that the aggression is played out in a way that is socially acceptable, right? And we can see when a person is sublimating their issues, how totally unaware they can be that they're using excessive force, or they're being totally cruel to somebody simply because they have an authority label. And you can also see sublimation in artists who channel their feelings and repressed or denied urges into artwork and sculpture and so forth. And sublimation can be a very healthy defense in that regard. Dissociation is where, and this is common in trauma, dissociation is where there is a kind of a temporary, drastic modification of who you are as a person or certain characteristic to not deal with emotional distress, right? So you tell someone, grandma has passed away or grandpa has passed away, and they have no reaction at all. It's almost as if it didn't happen because they cannot emotionally deal with it at that moment. So it becomes turned off and delayed. They dissociate it and they might feel it later. And I was telling some people before the talk that a lot of us we do this when we're taking care of a loved one who's sick, or I think a lot of us are doing it during COVID, where you sort of have your tears later. You're dead numb to it all the way through, let's say, the funeral of the person you took care of. And then some months later, you're walking down the street and you explode into tears, that kind of thing. Because the emotion has been completely dissociated or numbed, because that's a common reaction. One of the things the brain does to deal with extreme stress is it kind of shuts down its emotional reactivity. so that it's numb. It's a paradox that the more feeling you have, the more numb you get. But that's sort of what the brain does to survive. Intellectualization is where you simply break everything down into facts and logic so you don't have to feel the emotion. Like you say to a person, what do you think about this coronavirus? How have you been dealing? The person says, well, I have a 33% chance of surviving based upon my particular demographics. And I believe that if I get the shot, I have a 95% chance of being okay. And you say, but how do you feel about it? The person says, what do you mean? I don't have anything to worry about. These facts protect me. So it's a sort of a thinking that if you cling to facts, the world has suddenly become controllable again, right? Control is a major issue for these individuals. Altruism is where you constructively help other people as a way of vicariously dealing with your own stuff. A victim of sexual assault or a murder attempt channels that into a lifetime of helping other victims, right? Or a person who has, had a loved one die of COVID, decides to volunteer their time in an emergency room to help other people. They don't really realize that they're partially doing that as a way of alleviating their own horror at the idea that nobody was there for them, or that the world is such a place that these awful things can occur. So it's a kind of undoing of that, right? And humor, this is a defense mechanism commonly used, is where you make everything into a big joke, or you use wit or self-deprecation as a way of dealing with it. And you see this all the time. This is why we have jokes that are totally socially inappropriate or whatever. They're always about the things that we find the most anxiety provoking, because we think if we make a joke out of them, they become small and manageable. You won't hear too many Corona jokes, by the way. There's this sort of weird phenomenon in culture where you have to be away from an event a certain amount of time before it becomes acceptable socially for somebody to crack a joke about it. But COVID isn't funny to anyone, thank goodness. But it's a kind of a defense that some people might be using privately to deal with it. Now, in terms of what to do about this, unfortunately, the jury is out, because this is a unique stressor that's just a little bit too large scale. But in terms of general information that comes from what we know about trauma and stress, it's sort of clear that there are a couple of steps that are important to impart to people, particularly young people. And they really have to do with, first of all, remembering that you'll be of no use to anybody if you don't balance your own sort of mind-body dynamic, right? And so COVID has caused a lot of people to experience a complete change in diet, lack of exercise, changes in sleep, smoking, drinking, using drugs, not caring about their mental health, not taking care of even hygiene. You'd be surprised how many people only take care of themselves when they have to be on a Zoom screen, or are wearing pajamas underneath the outside of the Hollywood squares that we're all on here, the Brady Bunch boxes. You don't know what's going on outside that box. Well, the idea is that doing this not only for other people seeing you, caring about your weight because people see your abdomen, or caring about exercise because people have to see you in a swimsuit this summer, but doing it because it actually helps your own private mental health is important. And unfortunately, most of us have gotten the idea that it only matters socially. So if people aren't seeing this, let me throw it out the window. It's very important to emphasize to people that they've got to still do this stuff, because all of these things are having an effect on mental health. Okay? Secondly, it's very, very important to keep the immediate environment in control. So you can't stop with cleaning and organization. We all know, for example, from our student days, and you have students that do it now, I have no doubt, that have a paper of 30 pages due on a Tuesday. And on Monday night, they're sitting up, drinking Coca-Cola and coffee to do it. And they say, I can't do this until I clean my bedroom. I'll clean the bedroom first, and then everything will be organized, and then I can do the paper. It's a weird, again, talk about displacement, but it's a kind of a process internally, right? So that's very important to make students and other people. And this is why the change in structure in terms of school environment has been disastrous, because the structured environment structures internally. Okay. The third thing is you have to watch what it is you're taking in terms of news and so forth. because there is such a thing as fatigue or exhaustion in terms of the stress level that a person can handle reading a newspaper or looking at the internet. It's sort of like if you were a medical doctor, you would tell people stay away from web MD, because you're going to read it and you're going to think you're going to have every side effect and you're going to die tomorrow because you have a paper cut, right? It's a kind of a ridiculous, it gives you way too much stress, so that you encourage people to keep a balance between the amount of information they're taking in and taking a break from it, getting out of social media a little bit, or so forth. Then it helps to teach people that their brain needs to be in a state of preparation. People are more comfortable, for example, if they feel they have a certain amount of money in the bank, they have a little bit of food on hand in case there's a catastrophe, they have the supplies that might become in high demand, they have to get refills of their medications, etc. And this is very important because and we saw it like with the run on toilet paper, for example, at the beginning of COVID, because the brain has a need for this. This is the stress reduction technique. So teaching people to be prepared helps. How to protect yourself, yet you teach people the facts. It gives you a sense of control if you wash your hands, if you wear your mask, if you know the percentage of alcohol there should be in your sanitizer, because some sanitizers are useless, right? Don't touch your eyes, nose, and mouth. The distance you should have between people, becoming aware of how much you touch people. All of that, even if a lot of it, later on the information got changed, it had a psychological effect. It gave us a sense of control. So that's important. And finally, it helps to know that you're adding to the life and the support and the presence of the people around you who love you by keeping them safe. You have less of that anxiety. I'm going to lose all of my supports. They're all going to die. They're all going to get sick. If you're contributing to their welfare, so you teach people how important it is to wear a mask or stay clean or so forth, because it has the higher meaning of helping other people, of helping society. And a healthy individual actually benefits from hearing that. A person who's more borderline or psychotic, I don't think could give a flying fig. But a more, neurotic individual or healthier individual will understand that they're helping other people by taking care of themselves. Now, as professionals, a couple things you want to remember. Number one, it's very important among yourselves to be okay with the fact that people are going to have to process candidly what they're feeling. And they're going to tell you things that a few years ago would be unimaginable because it would be considered like a little inappropriate. Like 2 years ago, you wouldn't pull an employee aside and say, I can't stop sobbing in my office. But in the COVID period, you have to be okay with the fact that your colleagues are not themselves. They're trying to hold it together, but they're going to tell you things in private that are really, really powerful. Like, I want you to know that I haven't slept all night because I kept sitting up thinking like, oh my God, I'm going to lose everybody in my family. Or I just can't stop thinking about those poor people who couldn't even go to a funeral, that they had to say goodbye to people on Zoom, or I don't really want to be here. I kind of just want to be home in my pajamas. People are going to say things to you, particularly when you go back, that are going to come across as a little unboundaried or a little much. And you have to be okay to sit with that and encourage people that it is okay to talk, and that they maybe want to go find someone to talk to. And you don't want to pathologize that, because all of us are through the roof with anxiety right now. Okay. Now, you want to also help people to manage uncertainty, and you want to redirect unrealistic expectations and fears that they have. So if a person is telling you something that is blatantly over the top untrue, it's okay to correct them. So if the person says to you, I'm not getting a vaccine, I think that vaccine is going to make me go blind. I read in the newspaper that there was one person somewhere who got, it's okay to say to them, look, I'm not here to, tell you that you're wrong, but I want to help put in perspective for you that I got the shot and nothing happened to me, and nobody I know had anything happen to them. And the truth is, like, it's kind of the right thing to do, because you're really doing it for everyone else. It's your kind of duty socially to kind of help everyone else by making everyone else safe. It's okay to have that kind of chat with people. Another thing is, you have to avoid burnout, and you have to set a boundary with COVID talk and so forth, Because if you burn out, you're not going to be of any use to anyone else. If you're trying to help the students in a guidance counselor's office and you are crying your eyes out when they walk out of the room, you need a break. There is nothing wrong with saying, listen, I know this is weird because I've been sitting in my house for a year and a half, but I need a vacation. There's nothing wrong with that because the fact of the matter is we were not sitting home relaxing. That was not a vacation. And so I think all of us are going to need breaks when this is over. Nothing wrong with modeling for others how to manage things. Nothing wrong with feeling that you're sort of showing people that there is a way to make life livable, even in isolation, and telling people about things you're doing that help you. Encourage socialization if it's safe. Let's all have a Zoom call once a week so we could check in and all know that we're all alive and we can show care for each other. There's nothing wrong with having a support group for the people that work in a school where once a month they check in with each other to see how they're doing in terms of burnout or issues. I think you're going to see a lot of that in the high school setting of teachers that need to talk to each other for a little while about how they're feeling and managing things. Because what's going to happen is, remember what I said about dissociation, most of us are going to feel this stuff when we go back, once it feels safe to let your feelings come out. And so that's when people are going to need a place to process. Okay. You want to resist becoming a rescuer. Don't be the one that thinks that they're going to be the hero that like saves every student, probing every kid about how they're doing from COVID. It's gonna overwhelm you, and it plays out those kind of altruistic defense mechanisms that really have more to do with you sometimes than they have to do with other people. So you want to be careful not to develop narcissistic fantasies that you're going to save everyone, right? It's okay to do it on a small scale. Always, no matter what, give off a message of hope. And remember that this existential meaning is key. When you start talking to young people about how COVID affected them, you're going to see right away that the source of a lot of the depression and anxiety is that people are losing their sense of why they even are here anymore. What is the point of all of this? Now, in a Catholic high school, you at least have the advantage that most of the people who are attending have some spiritual belief. And you can use that to your advantage in helping them understand that there might be a spiritual significance, or it might be seen as a time when we all get to kind of introspect or pray more or develop who we are spiritually, or perhaps the culture had gotten a little sick and this was a chance for us to sit still and get our priorities straight. Or perhaps you might say that it's a time that really brings out the sheep and the goats in terms of who cared about others and who was totally selfish. You can explain to people that this was a time that really showed our character and what it is we believe. I think there you might say to a person, who is religious, it means a lot to God to see that you held on to faith even when things got to Job levels of horror, right? So that you want to say things like that to people to help them keep their faith. If people have no faith or they have no sense of existential meaning, it's very hard to make their mind grasp something like COVID. And we understand this from people like Viktor Frankl, who wrote about how people got through things like Nazi Germany by thinking about the meaning of their suffering, or that when they got out, they could see their loved ones again, possibly, or that they were doing it for some higher spiritual meaning. Those people tended to survive because they had a purpose to go on and not let themselves simply collapse. We talked a little bit about correcting the misinformation up there, so I'll sort of skip that. And this also we touched upon about being frank about facts. You also want to encourage creative expression. This is the sublimation thing. In other words, you want people to use healthier defense mechanisms, right? So you have a person who's dealing more primitively with something, and you say, why don't you try to channel that into something? Why don't you, try to make art or, draw, paint, sing, play an instrument, do something that gets those feelings out. And it becomes a constructive process. For a lot of young people, sublimation is very, very powerful in terms of giving them a sense of identity and purpose. I'm sure you have students in the guidance office that tell you that what gets them through life is the idea that they're going to become a great singer, or they're going to become an athlete, or they're going to, because they view all of those things as an expression of their frustrations and their personal identity. And that helps. And finally, remember the importance of introspection and taking care of yourself physically, because as I mentioned earlier, that is going to help your own mental health. Now, in terms of, just flashing on the screen, the 8 things that experts are kind of encouraging people to do, just flash these up there. They kind of summarize what we've been talking about all along. Some people say that you should use apps on your phone, that you can encourage young people to do this, so that if you don't know how to meditate or how to get help, right, you can use your phone to find resources like crisis text lines, or an app that teaches you how to pray or meditate, right? And all these other kinds of things that we've discussed are also here. And I wanted to just flash on the screen my contact information, because I do treat people who are experiencing general psychological issues, particularly young people. And I've been seeing some people who are dealing with COVID as a stressor, and it's bringing out a lot of problems for them, particularly people who are becoming a little bit more psychotic-like, or really struggling to deal with the reality, or more OCD-like, but also people who have more general anxiety and depression. And these are people that I would see in my private practice, which is at 276 Fifth Avenue at the corner of 30th and Manhattan, with Clarity Psychotherapy. And my phone number is 347-351-7010. That's kind of like a work cell, so you can give that number directly to students or parents, no problem. And my email is there too. And you can reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns or thoughts, particularly about students where you're concerned about serious mental illness, violence, so forth, but also people with more general issues, anxiety, depression, autism, OCD, trauma, and I'd be more than delighted to do a consult, which is free of charge, and see if perhaps they're interested in entering into psychotherapy. So I hope that this was helpful. It's really a great deal of information we went through, and I wonder if there are any questions or thoughts. I'll be more than happy to answer them. I hope that everybody found this useful.
Thank you, Dr. Brucato. It definitely was. Any questions from anyone who joined us? We had some people who joined us a little bit late. I did tape it. I did record it.
Any questions? Anything that was particularly interesting or unexpected?
Let's see if there are any questions. I actually particularly like the self-care portion.
Important.
Sorry?
No, it's very important. Extremely. Yeah.
Because, I called you to, discuss COVID for our students, and I realize what you were saying about us is absolutely true, that there will
Yes.
be some inappropriate moments. And I'm thinking,
Yes.
wow, that was me this year with my coworkers, and that was my coworkers with me, and thinking,
That's right.
we had a rough year, and not only a rough year, but starting from March, and we were all at home, and we had Zoom meetings at home, and then we did come back hybrid, but it's been very difficult to come into a school that's been half empty. And I know you're half full, but I still
It's really empty.
you see it, when your school is filled with students, and then suddenly there's 5 in the hallway and 250 at home. It's so hard not to have it break your heart. And it's very hard to have a screen. It's a black screen, and there's a mute button, and there's their name. It's I mean, I don't want to sound dramatic, but that's traumatizing. And
Yes.
I've had that moment with my coworkers, and telling them, I can't sleep sometimes at night, and especially during the middle of the year when we were getting COVID tests, and I've gotten 8 COVID tests this year, and I'm like, I just can't believe that somebody was shoving something in my nose so many times. And it's, I've had those moments. So, I had this idea to talk about trauma related to COVID for the students. And I'm thinking, okay, this was for the students, but this was also for us.
Well,
So
that's a little bit of, we all do that with the altruism thing that I talked about earlier, right? That it's that in helping others, it's sort of an indirect way of helping ourselves.
Yeah.
Because if they improve, the environment improves, we'll feel better.
Yeah.
But the fact is that that constellation of experiences is actually very normal right now. And so what's happening is that people are not telling each other because they're remembering when telling somebody that before COVID might be embarrassing. But but during COVID, that's like everybody.
Right.
So that it would almost be bizarre if somebody held together perfectly, like as if nothing happened. Would be odd. You would wonder if they were intellectualizing or dissociating or repressing or using some other defense mechanism because it's simply too much of an experience. Now, you're not expecting people to be, necessarily ripping their hair out, but you would expect them to have some degree of emotional reactivity to the constant exposure to a traumatic, unpredictable environment. So, one of the important mantras that I teach people that I treat that are dealing with this kind of thing is to remember that everything in life, good and bad, is temporary. The
Right.
point is that the very mechanism which terrifies you, which is that you might lose everything you love, you might lose control, you might lose your home, you might lose your money, is the same mechanism by which you don't have to worry that much because that will end too. The painful period will end too. And the fact of the matter is that throughout history, pandemics have happened before. Now, I don't say this just to intellectualize. The fact of the matter is, putting things in proper perspective, this will end.
Mm-hmm.
There will be terrible casualties. There will be terrible, particularly to other nations that can't afford vaccines. Hopefully, we will help them, and it looks like we will, because there is this attitude at the time, that perhaps we should help others, which is great. And I think that as long as you hold in mind the constant, fleeting, ever-changing nature of reality, it becomes a little easier to bear that if you just hang on, it will pass.
Mm-hmm.
Everything passes. In fact, there's a famous story told. Lincoln told it actually, although I don't know where he got it from. But the story is that there was a king or a leader in the East that tasked his wise people, to come up with a statement that would be true all the time, no matter what anybody ever said to you. So that if a person came to him for counsel, speaking a language that he couldn't understand, where he had to translate one single sentence to give back to them, or one single answer to give to the question, he wanted the answer to be the same all the time. And the answer, the famous answer, which most of us will have heard before, that they came up with was, "This too shall pass."
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you think about it, that's a rather brilliant story, because the reality is it is the answer to everything. There is no thing that will not eventually pass. And I think that's the thing that makes the COVID virus period so difficult, is that it put us all in touch with the reality that we will pass and that the things around us will pass. And we had to come to the grim realization that life is finite. We are a culture that does things like go to the gym until we're 80 and put lipstick on a corpse in a funeral like they're going to get up and dance. We don't understand that death happens. And from a spiritual perspective, it means that we don't think anything comes after death. So that we have lost the idea that that is the target towards which each of our respective cannonballs is blasting. We're all coming in for a landing. You see what I'm saying? So the point is that the virus has made us too aware of the reality of death. And that is the great taboo of the time we're living in. In the 1960s and previously, the great taboo was sex. The great taboo now is death. And I think that it was very useful in a strange way that the virus reminded us of this reality and this finality. And the idea that everything, including ourselves, will pass. So that we have to find a way to make a mark. And so I think the only way out of it for a lot of people is not only to reduce anxiety and have the stressor go away, but then to make meaning out of it. If you don't make meaning out of it, it's going to feel like one big giant period that was just terrible. And so you want to sort of, even in your own private life, through meditation, prayer, thought, whatever, try to come to grips with why this happened, what it says about us and how we handled it, and learn from it. There's nothing else you can do. Anyway, so I think that's wonderful, Christine, that's wonderful that you voiced that, because I think it encourages other people who are probably feeling the same thing. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that the bottom line is that everything passes, because
Yes.
I'm going to take that with me tonight to the prom, and that it will be over. I'm dreading it. I'm tired, and
And
it's
it'll
going to be
pass.
over.
That's right.
But that said, Gary, you are a treasure trove of knowledge, and I appreciated listening. So thank you very much.
Oh, that's
Yes,
wonderful.
I also want to add to that. Cecilia is our fearless leader at Lachlan, and I couldn't have said it any better. But you were amazing. The information was certainly very, very much related to what we experience on the daily, and very helpful. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Oh, that's wonderful. And remember, you're
Mhm.
going to probably have some patients that I could help. Some
Okay.
students and that can become patients. So
Yes.
don't
So,
forget that I'm out there.
right. So Christine, you're going to put Gary's information out for everybody, right?
Yeah, I will.
So we don't have to, good.
Save
Okay.
recording.
We have a number of therapists at Clarity Therapy. We work together, and they are
Good.
just fabulous treaters. They're wonderful. They all have sort of a mixture of different areas of expertise in a lot of
Good.
cases. But we also see general difficulties. And if
Mhm.
full, or if a person would be better served by working with a different clinician,
Mhm.
ask them to the appropriate person. My attitude is the most important thing is to get somebody the care that they need.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good.
So
Okay.
And
all
then
right.
Bye, everybody. I gotta go get beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care. Enjoy the prom.
All right, thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
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 Okay, Christina, is the talk ending for everyone, or
Yes, yes.
okay,
Does
wonderful.
anybody have any questions? Don't leave. Does anybody have any questions before I end our webinar? I'm going to save it on my computer. I'm going to do a little magic and I'm going to send it out to everyone. Are we good? Dr. Brucato, thank you so much. This really was excellent. It was really riveting, and I'm going to take a lot of the information with me, especially about trauma as it relates to when there is trauma by a person and trauma by an actual event. That's actually really mind-blowing for me. So I really do appreciate that, just in general, but just the whole talk was really wonderful. So thanks everyone. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you, Dr. Brucato, for giving this wonderful talk.
Take care.
All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great day, and I will talk to you all soon.